All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for week 3 of our second annual Health Equity Challenge Series book discussion. We are reading Medical Bondage, Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology by Dr. Deirdre Cooper Owens, who we had the pleasure of meeting a couple of weeks ago. But today we are very fortunate to have Professor Ayesha Hardaway. She is an associate professor at Case Western Reserve University School of Law and the director of the Criminal Clinic in the Milton A. Kramer Law Clinic. As a member of the faculty, Professor Hardaway has taught as a clinician in the areas of health law, civil litigation, and criminal justice. Her research and scholarship interests include the intersection of race and the law, constitutional law, criminal law, policing, and civil litigation. Prior to joining the law school faculty, Professor Hardaway practiced in the litigation department of Tucker Ellis, LLP. Her 6 years at the firm were devoted to defending major electrical, automotive, and pharmaceutical manufacturers during all phases of litigation as trial counsel and national coordinating counsel. Professor Hardaway represented those clients in state and federal courts throughout the country. Before her time at Tucker Ellis, Professor Hardaway was an assistant prosecuting attorney for Cuyahoga County and handled a variety of criminal matters, including juvenile delinquencies and general felonies. Professor Hardaway serves as the deputy monitor on the independent monitoring team appointed to evaluate police reforms implemented by the Cleveland Police Department under a federal consent decree. All right, Professor Hardaway, the floor is yours to begin our discussion.
Oh, I'm muted. I'm trying to find my notes. Give me 1 second. I just realized that, here we go. Give me 1 second.
Absolutely.
Okay. I thought that they were up on one document and now I'm seeing, there we go. Okay, let's see if, I just have a few slides that I hope I'll be able to share, but I don't know if with you might see the little stuff in the side. So if I could share my screen, that would be great.
Absolutely.
Okay. Wonderful. Okay, here we go. I hope you all can see this okay. Can you see the first screen okay? Does it just say contested relations, slavery, sex, the title screen? Awesome. Thank you so much. So I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much, Ms. Thompson, for the invitation to be here to discuss chapter 3 of such an interesting book. I'm not in the medical profession, as you all just heard. And although I've done some medical malpractice litigation work, medicine is not my area, law is. And as a result, I thought it might be most appropriate for me to think about some of the legal cases and maybe expound a little bit during my 15 minutes with you all before we open up to a larger discussion. And so I don't know if folks are able, oh, you can see the little click to add title thing. Sorry about that. But I don't know if you all are familiar with the young lady pictured here. The little kid is Centoya Brown, and the woman with her is her mother. Centoya Brown was sentenced to life at prison at the age of 16. I don't know if you know her story, but she was accused and convicted as an adult. She was 16 years old, but she was convicted in adult court for killing a man who had picked her up at a local fast food restaurant in Nashville, Tennessee. The person who reportedly agreed to pay her for sex was found dead, naked in his bed from a gunshot wound to the head. Ms. Brown indicated that she shot him because she was afraid that he was going to shoot her first. He was 43 years old. Her boyfriend and pimp at the time was nicknamed Cutthroat, and he was 24. All of this occurred in 2004. She was sentenced to spend life in adult prison and would have died in prison, but for pressure from the public and celebrity pressure, more specifically, that led the governor in Tennessee to commute her sentence when folks raised questions and concerns about the ability of a 16-year-old, you see her here in the younger picture in court in her jumpsuit, of a 16-year-old to consent to sex, the human trafficking implications involved here. But she spent 15 years in prison before she was released as a result of that commutation from the governor. And this, of course, happens 2 centuries after much of the details in the reading for the chapter today. The man in the corner here, this is John Stafford, the individual. Oh, wait, I may have the wrong name there. That's the other young man, the other man. But that's the man who was killed, who was shot in the head by Ms. Brown. So one of the cases that, one of the early cases that's mentioned in the text and the footnotes actually of our chapter is Underwood versus La Capere. It's a Louisiana case, and though the author used it to illustrate how infants were treated as having no monetary value until they reached a certain age and could live away from their mothers, at which point, you know, the connection to the mother would be negated. This case really was not at all about whether or not a child should be valued or have monetary value. The question really was how to settle a lawsuit between the enslaver who purchased the mother and who was accompanied by her infant child, and the insurance agent, on the question of whether or not the agent needed to reimburse her for the money that she lost when the child was eventually returned back to the original enslaver as not having any value and not being bargained for in the purchase. Another case that was startling and horrific for me to read. I'd love to hear you all's thoughts and reactions to all of this chapter, but this one was particularly tough. This was where there was George, who was known as a slave in Mississippi, and charges brought by him by the state of Mississippi for raping, brutally raping a child that was under 10 years old. And the court, after his conviction, the appellate court was reviewing the question of whether or not, as detailed here, whether carnal knowledge of the child constituted a capital offense in Mississippi because George had been sentenced to death. The court said no, and its rationale really was that enslavers have an absolute right to the protection of their property, right? And so the life of George wasn't whether or not he should be sentenced to life. The question really wasn't looking at it from the perspective of George, but instead looking at it from the perspective of the enslaver, and whether or not the state would be able to take away that property because he had raped another enslaved person, in this case, a very young child. And the court held that because slaves are using an old Latin, but really from the Roman Empire, pro nullis, because they are pro nullis, meaning that they have no rights under the law, that neither civil law, common law, or criminal statutes could apply to them, and that only white and Native women, they said Indian in the statute, only white and Native women were protected by the statute. Not the young Black girl who was raped. This case wasn't in your reading, but I thought it might be helpful for us to bring some of these issues into the current, 1948 Georgia is the lifetime of my grandparents and my aunts and my uncles. My mother's born a short time after that. And on February 3rd of 1948, Rosalie Ingram, this Black woman who's featured here, and I'm sorry that one of her son's heads is cut off. I tried like the Dickens to get it to fit in the screen, but was unsuccessful. And two of her children, Wallace, who was 17, and Sammy Lee, who was 14, were convicted by an all-white jury after a one-day trial in Ellaville, Georgia. The local sheriff admitted that the sons acted in defense of their mother, Rosa, but nevertheless, the three family members were sentenced to death by electric chair for killing an armed white man in self-defense after he violently assaulted and threatened them. Though Wallace and Sammy Lee were both minors, they were eligible for execution under the law at the time. It took until 2005 for the U.S. Supreme Court to ban the execution of children. The white man who was killed, John Stafford, and Miss Ingram were both sharecroppers on the property owned by a white landowner. And the court opinion I read in preparation for our time today revealed that Miss Stafford hit Miss Ingram in the head with the butt of his rifle while threatening to sexually assault and shoot her. This was all over a dispute about her mules getting loose and near his crops. According to the Equal Justice Initiative, it took a post-trial motion and pressure from civil rights activists for the trial judge to change the Ingram's sentences from death to life imprisonment. And though Miss Ingram's and her sons no longer had death sentences, they were sent to the state penitentiary and were each forced to serve more than a decade in prison for daring to defend themselves against the violent armed assault of a white man. They were released on parole in 1958, which is a different scenario than we would see with individuals sentenced now to life in prison. So the next slide says like open discussion. Maybe I will stop sharing my screen so that I can see you guys and maybe you can see me better. Let me fix the view. There we go. In the hopes that maybe we could have a little bit of conversation and reactions to the chapter. I do have on another slide some questions to prompt our discussion, but I would much rather hear from you all first.
Dare I say that it might be helpful to maybe start with one of your scripture questions?
Okay, that's not a problem.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. So one of I have 5 here, so maybe that'll help us. So so the act of resistance and also the themes of resistance, autonomy, and agency are repeated themes throughout the chapter. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about who we see demonstrating resistance, autonomy, and agency in the chapter, and in what ways do we continue to see Black people in medicine operate out of similar themes today? That was the first thing that really struck me about the chapter.
I'll begin. Hi, everybody. I'm a little bit late. Andrea Lyons with Neighborhood Family Practice. What struck me, and is probably as a Black woman, as a mother in particular, was how women who would stand up when they saw their children being taken away or violated. And that spoke to me of that mama bear instinct that typically can creep up, even if you're not biologically related to a child that you see in distress. But that was very powerful for me. Yeah, that was very powerful.
Yeah. It's so interesting that you say that, because that's also something that stuck out to me. I think about the way in which my grandmother stood up for us in rural Georgia during part of my childhood. And she didn't think twice about it, you know? She didn't think twice about it, despite the terror that I know she lived through, right? So yeah, I agree. What about the midwives? I was also struck by some of the stories in the chapter, you know, how when confronted by white male doctors, some of the midwives basically like, and they're like, we don't need you here messing in this, but managed to save even white women's lives, right? During labor, and their children during labor. Yeah.
And even there, if I may, struck a memory for me is using bodily choice and performing abortions for the enslaved women as a way to escape persecution. So I was like, wow, talk about agency and power, and taking power over and enabling other enslaved women to take power and agency over their body so they can have a choice to have freedom. That was very powerful to me.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm Lindsay. Hi, thank you so much.
Hi.
I'm in the Department of Bioethics, but I have done historical research, and so one of the things that I think about with this is just how much, in terms of that resistance that comes through so clearly in these stories that are remarkable, how much Dr. Cooper Owens had to be working with documents that were trying to deny those things, and that it was like her that she had to be assembling such a variety of documents, many of which were documents that were sort of part of this oppressive system, that she's still able to see what's actually being revealed there, which is the sort of obvious work that these women were doing, and the risks they were taking, and the sort of empowerment. So I just think it's such a, a lot of people just sort of feels like throw up their hands and are like, well, we just don't have things from these women's perspective, so we can't go there. And so I just was so impressed with how she's able to work with the documents to find that evidence of what would have been obvious at the time, but gets obscured through so much of this.
Yeah. That strikes me. That sort of leads me to another thing that really impacted me. And it came as a result of one of the doctors saying to the midwife, like, we don't need your witch, hoodoo, whatever, like that comment, right? And I wondered how much of our, oh no, sorry, I mixed two thoughts. Let me erase all of that and let me go and say instead, how one of the comments in the chapter where on page 86, someone says that one of the women could hardly talk about what happened and the awful things that they had witnessed and that had gone through. And it struck me as, the reality of how much we lose in sort of like knowing our history and knowing the harms but also like still knowing in our bodies. Right. And how it surfaces, at least, I'll speak for me as a Black woman, how it surfaces in ways that you don't necessarily have a full explanation for, right? Because too often our ancestors didn't share, and who would want to share, right? The horrors, right, that they had been through, and the dehumanization and all of that. Any reactions, or I don't know. Okay. Maybe others will want to chime in here. We might be done well before time. It's a quiet group. In what ways does the chapter reveal, what's this question, how anti-Black standards of beauty and its impact develop on the development of medicine? Do we have any thoughts about the anti-Black standards of beauty that we see from the slave trade auction and throughout?
One of the things that struck me was the presumption that a white man would not want to rape someone who had those looks. That was like wow. I mean, there were so many, obviously, protections for white men, for all, against all women, but in particular enslaved Black women. But it's almost like, well, why would he want to do that to her, the way she looks, her stocky head? I forgot how she was characterized, but it was not in a very flattering way. And it was definitely an anti-Black and more Eurocentric perspective of beauty, how this woman was described. So yeah, it removes all agency around, like, yeah, you can be violated no matter what, yeah, no matter how people perceive you to look. So that was the piece around anti-Black beauty that hit me really hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was taken as legal evidence, or evidence that there could be no crime, right? As no matter what other information we had, that there's such a failure to see that humanity. Yeah.
Yeah. It's also interesting, right? Like when you think about the legal evidence and the pieces and parts, the gymnastics that the courts have to go through in order to dehumanize folks. So now we think about it as like, oh, we should believe, right, victims, we should believe survivors. But at this point, Black people weren't even granted the status of being human, much less the question of being believed. It was like, it's not possible because they're property and they don't have rights, and now we're to the point where there's all these gymnastics around the credibility, right, and those details and parts, as opposed to thinking about the reality that people hurt individuals, that men, and women will hurt people, and that rape is possible regardless of anyone's status or place in life. Yeah. So there's also some oh no, Lindsay, please go right ahead.
I was just gonna say that that also to me was in terms of comparing the institutions of medicine and of law, there was something interesting in this chapter about, she talks about how in medicine they sort of had to confront this reality, and they knew that the anatomy was the same. They knew that people were being harmed and brutalized. Like they somehow managed to set that aside, right? Like, and still have this sort of racist split, but they had that physical knowledge that this was the same. This was a person. This was harm, and then that somehow in law that was less the case, sort of. I mean, it's not as though it did much good in medicine either, because they still were published all this sort of horrible stuff, but that there's just like some difference in the sort of being forced to acknowledge somebody's humanity versus being able to just kind of point to precedent and say that's just not how we do it, or we just don't care about that, or something like that.
Yeah, the ways in which the legal system is used to reinforce harms as opposed to provide protections, is undoubtable. There's also, as I was reading the chapter, was ever sort of mindful of these physicians or these scientists and these researchers, right? And all of whether or even the people who are purchasing other humans, right, at the slave trade, the white gaze, right? And then when we get closer to the end of the chapter, right, the author actually even says white gaze, and I'm like, yes, because it's ever present, right? We talk about it a lot today, about the white gaze, and I don't know how, at least in my circles, folks talk about it, but I wonder if you guys could share anything about sort of your orientation to the white gaze, and your awareness of it, or an ability to sort of manage it.
Professor Hardaway, would you mind defining that for the group? Just so we can be on the same page. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think of the white gaze, and I think others think of the white gaze as really where Black life, Black experience, Black pain, right? The experiences of Black people are placed under the proverbial microscope of white folks for no other reason than like observation or entertainment, or even if folks say, you know, oh, I want to understand this more, there's a lack of genuine engagement, if you will, right, with their fellow humans in such a way that whether it's the pain, the joy, or whatever, right, ends up being more so, maybe the best way to say it is like a very one-sided interaction, right? Like a very one-sided interaction where the white gaze is ever present, and the Black experience is always being picked apart.
Yeah, and I'll comment, you know, clearly, not clearly, but I do have a lot of lived experience with this. And often people say, well, why do you belong to this Black group or that Black group? I'm like, because that is where I can be, period.
Mm-hmm.
Without that having to explain trauma that we understand that we go through, no matter how many degrees I may have and what neighborhood I live in and what car I might drive, it doesn't matter, because I'm still I feel trauma every day. So it's one of those things. So because of that, we typically shut down in certain circles. Like I have some very dear white friends, but very few that I will let in and share, because I'm only going to share if you're willing to make a personal sacrifice on your end to see how we can move this forward. And not necessarily for me. I'm always like, I'll be fine, right? Strong Black woman, I'll be fine. But I'm always like, what about women, Black women who are navigating these horrible systems that we have in place that are by design? Are you willing to sacrifice to change systems? Are you willing to sacrifice to move levers? Otherwise, back to your point, Professor Hardaway, it really is just for entertainment, and I'm not here to entertain. I'm like at an age, especially, I'm like, I'm not here to entertain. So that's just my piece, just based on my lived experience.
Yeah.
If I could add a comment from the research side, it is very much so the understanding that there's a lot of prioritization of exploring health disparities, health equity, creating these pipelines and pathways for the new class of researchers who will be doing this work, many of whom have decades of experience getting, you know, very hearty awards from federal governing bodies, private philanthropy. They've made that reputation. So it's very easy for them to slip in and just add health equity to a paper. And I'm generalizing here, and now they're an expert. So we have to be super careful about health equity tourism in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a really good article that I will send to the group after this meeting that talks about just that, and how we have to really look under the covers, flip the systems on their head, and understand that, as was said earlier, the systems are designed to produce the results that they are producing. So if you're not satisfied with the results, we need to change the systems.
Yeah. I'll say too, on the white gaze piece, I mean, I think even in the places where, or instances, so I remember wanting to engage with a counselor, right? Therapy, and oh, yes. Yeah, that's huge. Health equity tourism. And this might also be a piece of that. And so I went through the list of like covered providers through the insurance, right, network, and ended up with a woman, and in having to translate sort of my lived experience, you know, there was always this conversation of like, wow, basically like, you're such an exceptional Negro, you know. And it's like that is not why I'm here, right? This is I actually would love for you to engage me in sort of the the things that I'm bringing very honestly and vulnerable, right, to this conversation, and use your tools as a therapist to help me navigate the world. But that is not always, because so much of our professions are built off of, are based on models and insights that don't include the lived experience of Black people. It can very much feel like you're still in a petri dish, right? Yeah. Let's see. The only last one I had really was about our thoughts on sort of the bias of Indigenous African medicine, and any insights into how some of the ridicule that we see on page 80, right, with the don't want any witch doctors or hoodoo stuff, right, that how that has that ridicule and bias may have negatively impacted obstetrics and gynecology as we know it today. I feel bad because I feel bad, Lindsay and Jaleesa and Andrea, but thank you for being in conversation with me. If you have thoughts, don't feel pressure to if you don't.
So one of the thoughts that kind of came to mind when you said that was just the othering. Any way to remove yourself, even if you know it's effective. I didn't come up with that. So there can't be any validity in that.
Mm-hmm.
And when you could have been collaborative and in partnership and transformative. I know I'm saying a lot of things that seem comical for this time period, but why not?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's if you, think too about the level of, one of the things that's, thinking about 19th century medicine is like, so often medicine, like Western medicine, establishment medicine, like it didn't work and it would hurt people. Like it was the things that we would do to try to help people in the 19th century killed them half the time, right? Like it wasn't as though it was actually this impressive and successful science. It was like they were using terrible devices. Like, so the fact that, I think for most people in most settings, the sort of other methods were better and more effective. And so the fact that that is sort of what's being set aside. And I do think about the ways that we still have attitudes like that or discussions like that, and the way we talk about childbirth, or the way that we talk about how we should deal with patients who have different ideas about what would be the most healthy thing for them or something like that. Like, we still have a lot of people who deride people who don't want to sort of accept whatever, I don't know, sort of medical care that can be violent, or we like sort of laugh at people who have different cultural beliefs about what it means to be healthy or something like that. And that you can see how the transition towards the kind of medical science that people like Sims were doing is still shaping. I think how we think about what's legitimate medical expertise and what's not. The discourse even now around like midwifery versus wanting to be next to a like level 3 NICU or whatever, like that, those conversations are still stuck in some of this stuff. I do.
Yeah, and I'll add on. It's often when I'm in a company of Black women, we're mothers, we often have a story of harm around birthing. It's almost invariable. It's almost like one of those things that is kind of a given. And I too have a story. And my first baby, I was probably about 36 weeks pregnant, and my OB decided she wanted to have me go early. So she took, and I tell this story to people because I mean, it's very, it hits me. That child is 24 years old now and is a student at Case, by the way. I have to do a shout out. She's a physician assistant in the program there. But this OB decided to strip my membranes without my permission. I did not know what was happening to me. I was in pain at my visit. I was like, I asked her, what are you doing to me? Now, mind you, at this time, I'm a professional woman, all the degrees, it doesn't matter. I was at a great hospital. And so she was like, oh, this is normal. And I said, this doesn't feel normal. And I was by myself. My husband was at work. I didn't think I needed to have somebody there with me. And I'm in physical pain during a routine exam. Fast forward, within like 24 hours, I had premature rupture of membranes. Like my water broke. I was not in labor. And so interventions, like Lindsay, you talk about these medicalized interventions had to then happen, which I'm like, I'm trusting the system. Fortunately, everything worked out. But I realize now, because then I empowered myself with more information, I just presume I have great insurance. I have all these great things. I live in like this great neighborhood. I'll be fine. But I know now, obviously, I was very much at risk. And so it worked out well. But then with my second pregnancy, because I do have privilege and I have resources, I had a doula. I had a friend who happened to be a Black OBGYN, again, privileged because of the circles I was in. So I had a different doctor, I had a different situation. I was able to deliver in the manner without a lot of any intervention the way I wanted to. But that begs the fact that there's so many people who don't have. And again, I'm always like, I'll be fine, right? That's just kind of my thing. But I'm always like, what about those who don't have access? So that's where we do need to use our privilege, our power, our voices for every woman to have less intervention, to have people there who, while they're birthing, to like doulas and midwives and so forth that really care for them. Because once midwifery was removed as like voodoo and only like poor Black women did that work and it became then this white man's domain, it became all about interventions. And then that's where we see these outcomes in particular for Black women, which are ridiculous. We all know the stats in Cleveland are terrible. And I tell people, it's not just poor Black women, it's unfortunately women who have Black women who have resources, because they're probably like me going in, I'll be fine, have everything, quote unquote, and we're not protected. So I love to share that story because it does show that it can happen, and it's scary and it's frightening, and we have to take back our power.
Yeah. Thank you
If I
so
could
much
read-
for sharing that story. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. If I could read a quote from page 81, the enslaved is legally unable to give consent or offer resistance. She is presumed to be always willing. And that dovetails, unfortunately, very nicely with the story that your experience, not story.
Yeah. 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 No need to ask you for consent, right? Because you're presumed you're going to go with whatever she says or does. Yeah. Yeah, we know that the health disparities, it doesn't matter degrees, right? That the outcomes for childbirth for an educated Black woman with an advanced degree is the same as a young white girl who has not finished high school. Right? That's what the data tells us on the health disparities for childbirth and pregnancies and maternal health. I also would be remiss to not sort of ask or see what you all's orientation to, if at all, is to sort of the removal of Black and Brown and non-English speaking midwives and from the practice. I have a girlfriend who is both a doula and a midwife. And my daughter actually got her doula certification during her COVID year between undergrad and her professional school. And so they tell me, and apparently there was just a conference in DC focused on increasing the need to increase Black and non-English speaking midwives in the profession, because at this point midwifery is becoming very much akin to sort of the OBGYN space. There are no people of color.
Oh, I think that's one of the concerns as the profession or space, if you will, becomes legitimized. And I'm not using that word because that's the word I want to use. I'm using that word because that's the word that is used. And as we look at the payers and reimbursement, it becomes washed.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say that I before I came here, worked at a school with a lot of preclinical students, like undergrad students who were really interested in clinical careers. And I think the most common desired pathway for the Black women in my classes was like a nurse midwife program. Like they were so hungry to do it. Like they were laser, for every paper they wrote for every class was about obstetrics, everything. Like they were so and I still write letters for them or follow them in it, and there's just not enough, there's not clear enough pathways into it for them, and some of them are doing it and doing well, and some of them are just trying and it's not happening. And I feel like the program closest to us closed and like all of these things. So I think it's so clear that there was a real passion and desire to change that field and to shape that field. And I hope that can be backed up by more resources to do it, I think is one of the things I left feeling. But, yeah.
We do have a Black midwife at our organization, and I know Village of Healing is also a Black-led midwifery practice, and they're doing, their outcomes are incredible. And at Neighborhood Family Practice, we do have a Black midwife, and I do have to say, of the other four, we have 5 other 4 midwives. They are very committed. So if somebody says they want to come and do clinical rotations with them, don't let this go out beyond this. It's recorded. So, but they really are very hyper focused on accepting Black students. They're very intentional about it. So, because there aren't enough hours, there aren't enough to have rotations and so forth, and to bring somebody on, they're very committed to it. But it's hard, and not a lot of people. Lindsay, I'm so encouraged to hear that so many Black women are interested in the field and want to pursue it. But we all know healthcare it's highly where it's redlining, let's just say it, call it what it is, where we see folks in clinical spaces, Black and Brown people are on the front line, medical assistants, and the lowest paid, and it is just the economics of it. We have medical assistants at our organization, and they're mostly Black and Brown. It's a system. It's we want to pay people more, but again, the system is really set up, and we try to pay folks as much as possible, but the system is set up that it does not value individuals at that level, and that's again another system failure. And and our providers are overwhelmingly white, and our patient population is mostly, we're on the West Side, so mostly Hispanic, Latinx, and Black folks and white folks. So it's really hard. We're trying hard to recruit and do something different, but it's tough out there. My daughter, she's in that PA program at Case, which is phenomenal. She's a first year. It is awesome. She is one of 2 Black students in a 40 cohort class. That's it. That's it.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. And somebody said, "Oh, that's great." No, I'm like, "No, that ain't great." Oh,
No.
how's that great? It's great she's there, but it is not great. Like, let's not celebrate that exceptionalism like you talked about, Professor Hardaway. Let's not celebrate that. I don't want to be exceptional. I just want everybody to be and do as I am able to navigate, and even better. So I'm off my stage.
Yeah, and let's not confuse racist discrimination with exceptionalism, right? Let's not confuse the two, right? And also the impact of our babies when they have to be, though, right? Like you said, it's like, I'm fine. I'm one of one. It's fine. I'll be okay. I'll make do. But then, like, when I think about it for my children, that's like, that is not acceptable. My daughter's partner is the only Black person in his entire first year section at University of California, Irvine's law school this fall. And my heart breaks every time I think about him sitting in those classrooms alone, right? It's not okay. It's not okay. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure being with you, ladies. Thank you so much, Jaleese, Andrea, and Lindsay. I love being in conversation with you. Jaleese, I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to read something other than what I would normally be reading at this point in the semester. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Hardaway, and everyone who has joined us today. I will very quickly share my screen. Next week, we hope that you will join us. We'll hear from Charlotte Rich. She's a doctoral student in the history of science and medicine at Yale University, and her research topic is Irish immigrant women, and we are very excited to hear from her as well. So everyone, please have a great afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank
Bye.
you.